"Sir, step away from the grave now." The voice cracked across the cemetery like a gunshot. The man didn't flinch, not at first. He stood motionless before a weathered headstone, one hand resting gently on the cold marble, the other clutching a small bouquet of white lilies. His shoulders were broad but slightly bowed, as if the weight of the ground itself pressed down on him. "Sir, I said step away." This time, the command came closer, sharper. Boots crunched against gravel. Visitors nearby turned their heads. A woman paused mid-prayer. An old veteran lowered his cap. A hush spread through the rows of headstones like a held breath. Slowly, deliberately, the man turned. He was black, mid-50s, well-dressed but plainly. Dark slacks, pressed coat, no jewelry. His face was calm, but his eyes carried something deeper than anger. "Yes, officer?" he said quietly. The younger cop sneered, hand already resting on his belt. "You been coming here every week." The man nodded once. "Yes." "Same day, same time." "Yes." The older officer stepped forward then, gray at the temples, jaw tight with suspicion instead of wisdom. He glanced at the name on the headstone, then back at the man. "You got a reason for hanging around this grave so much?" A murmur rippled through the cemetery. The man looked back at the stone, then down at the flowers in his hands. "She's my wife," he said. The younger cop laughed, short, sharp, ugly. "Your wife?" he scoffed. "This grave's been here 30 years. The man's jaw tightened. "Yes." The older officer's eyes narrowed. "And yet, you don't look a day over 60. Silence. The accusation hung there, heavy and unspoken. "You're telling us you were married to her when you were what, 20, and you just keep showing up? No family, no ceremony, just you?" The man took a breath, controlled, measured. "She didn't like crowds, even in life." The younger cop rolled his eyes. "That's not an answer." The older officer circled him slowly, like a wolf pretending to be patient. "We've had reports. A man matching your description lingering here. Makes people uncomfortable." The man looked up then, straight into the officer's eyes. "I come to speak to my wife. Once a week, I leave flowers, then I go home." The younger cop snorted. "That's so." He leaned closer, invading the man's space. "Because from where we're standing, it looks like trespassing, or casing, or worse." A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere behind them. The man didn't step back. "I've done nothing wrong," he said. The older officer exhaled through his nose, clearly annoyed by the calm. "Then you won't mind answering a few questions." He nodded toward the headstone. "You say she's your wife. What's her name?" The man glanced back at the stone, at the letters he knew better than his own heartbeat. "Margaret Elaine Carter." The younger officer smirked. "Funny, that's what it says." The man said nothing. The older officer folded his arms. "What was her maiden name?" The man answered without hesitation. "What hospital was she born in?" Answered. "What year did she die?" Answered. The younger cop's smirk faltered, but suspicion didn't leave. It hardened. "So why not bring proof? Marriage certificate, ID, something." The man finally showed a flicker of emotion. Sadness. "She didn't like papers," he said softly. "She liked promises." The younger cop scoffed again. "That's convenient." The older officer's voice dropped. "Sir, you need to understand how this looks." The man nodded slowly. "I understand how it looks. I've understood my whole life." That stopped them, just for a second. Then the older officer gestured sharply. "Turn around." Gasps scattered across the cemetery. The man didn't resist. He gently placed the flowers at the base of the headstone, straightened the ribbon, and whispered something too quiet for anyone to hear. Then he turned and placed his hands behind his back. Cold metal clicked shut around his wrists. The younger officer pulled him a little too hard. "You don't get special treatment just because you dress nice." The man stumbled, caught himself, and said nothing. As they walked him away, the camera of a nearby visitor began recording, and behind them, carved deep into the headstone, ignored until now, were words that would soon change everything. Beloved wife, civil rights attorney. She spent her life defending the innocent. The officers hadn't read it yet, but they were about to learn, and when they did, the questions would stop, and the shame would begin. The patrol car door closed with a dull thud. Inside, the air was stale, leather, disinfectant, and something colder, judgment. The man sat upright in the back seat, wrists cuffed but posture unbroken. Through the rear window, he could still see the cemetery gate, the iron bars slowly drifting farther away as the engine idled. The younger officer slid into the passenger seat, irritation still clinging to him like sweat. The older one took the wheel, adjusted the mirror, and for the first time actually looked at the man's face, really looked. "Name," he said flatly. "James Carter," the man replied. The officer scribbled it down. "Date of birth." James answered. The younger officer twisted around in his seat. "Occupation?" James paused for half a second, not because he didn't know, but because the answer carried weight. "I'm retired." The younger cop scoffed. "From what?" James met his eyes through the metal grate. "From keeping promises." The older officer sighed sharply. "Enough with the poetry, just answer the question." "I was a machinist," James said calmly. 32 years, Lockhart Manufacturing. That seemed to disappoint them. No criminal edge, no nervous stutter, no holes to poke. The car rolled forward. Outside, trees passed slowly, their leaves stirring in a light breeze, peaceful, indifferent to what was happening inside the vehicle. The younger officer tapped at the dashboard. "So," he said, casual but cruel, "tell us again why you're obsessed with that grave." James didn't answer right away. "She was my wife," he said again. "I visit her once a week." "That headstone says she died in '92. That's a long time to still be hanging on." James's jaw tightened, just slightly. "Love doesn't expire," he said. The younger officer laughed. "That's rich." He turned to the older one. "You hear that? Love." The older officer didn't laugh this time. He glanced at the notes again. "Margaret Elaine Carter," he read aloud. "Attorney." James nodded. "Civil rights attorney," the older officer continued slowly, eyes flicking up. "That's what the stone says." James closed his eyes for a brief moment. "Yes." The silence stretched. The younger officer shifted, suddenly less amused. "You're saying your wife was one of those?" James opened his eyes. "She defended people who couldn't defend themselves, if that's what you mean." The older officer cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, James," he corrected himself, "you have to understand why this raised concerns." James nodded. "I do. You come every week, same time, same grave. People notice patterns." "So did she." James' voice softened. The officer paused. "What do you mean?" James leaned back slightly, chains rattling. "Margaret taught me that patterns tell the truth, not accusations, not fear. Patterns." The younger officer rolled his eyes. "You're saying we're wrong?" "I'm saying you didn't look. You reacted." The room went quiet. The older officer glanced at the file again, then at James. "You ever been arrested before?" "No." "Ever questioned?" James smiled sadly. "More times than I can count." The officer nodded slowly, as if something uncomfortable had clicked into place. "Why didn't you bring ID?" the younger one snapped, breaking the moment. James looked down at his hands. "Because I didn't expect to be treated like a suspect for loving my wife." The older officer rubbed his temples. "You have family?" "No, she was my family." Another silence, then a knock at the door. A young female officer peeked in, eyes uneasy. Sergeant, you should see this." She handed over a tablet. The older officer's brow furrowed as he read. "What is it?" the younger one asked. The sergeant didn't answer right away. "Her name," he said slowly. "Margaret Carter." James watched his face change, confusion giving way to recognition. She's in the database." The younger officer stiffened. "For what?" The sergeant swallowed. "For cases. Big ones. Landmark ones." He scrolled. "She helped overturn wrongful convictions, sued departments, changed policies." The room felt smaller. James spoke quietly. "She believed the truth mattered more than comfort." The younger officer's confidence faltered. "So what? That makes him untouchable?" The sergeant shook his head. "No, but it makes this sensitive." He looked at James differently now. "Mr. Carter." "James," he corrected himself. "Why didn't you tell us who she was?" James met his eyes steadily. "You never asked who she was. You only asked who I was." The words hit like a verdict. Outside, a few officers had begun to whisper. Someone had already pulled up old news articles, headlines, photos. A young Margaret Carter standing at courthouse steps, a firm expression, determined eyes. And just beside her, just slightly out of frame, a younger James, holding her coat. The sergeant exhaled slowly. "Let's go back to the cemetery." The younger officer snapped his head up. "What?" "We're not done here," but neither was he. James closed his eyes again, not in relief, in patience, because he knew something they were just beginning to understand. This wasn't about a man at a grave. It was about a legacy no one wanted to remember, and it was about to force itself into the light. The cemetery gates creaked open as the patrol car rolled back inside. James watched the rows of headstones pass like old acquaintances. He knew every crack in the path, every leaning marker, every tree that cast shade at just the right hour. This place had been his quiet sanctuary for over 30 years. Now it felt exposed. The car stopped near Margaret's grave. The sergeant stepped out first, postures stiff but slower than before. The younger officer followed, jaw tight, eyes darting around as if the dead themselves might accuse him. James was uncuffed this time. No apology was offered, but the silence said enough. "Go ahead," the sergeant said gruffly. "Show us what you do every week." James stepped onto the grass carefully, as he always did. He knelt, straightened the small American flag someone from the Veterans Association had placed months earlier, and brushed away fallen leaves from the headstone. Margaret Elaine Carter, 1956, 1992. Beloved wife, tireless advocate. Justice is love made visible. The younger officer read it aloud without realizing it. His voice faltered halfway through. James reached into his coat and pulled out the lilies, slightly wilted now, but still white. She loved lilies, said they reminded her that beauty doesn't ask permission. He placed them gently at the base. The sergeant cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, James, why every week? Same day, same time?" James smiled faintly. "Because Wednesdays were court days." Both officers looked at him. She'd come home exhausted. Win or lose, she'd sit right there. He pointed to a patch of grass beside the grave. Shoes off, head back. She'd say, "If I stop coming here, I'll forget why I started." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "So this is, what, a ritual?" he asked. James looked up slowly. "It's a promise." The wind rustled the trees, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and earth. "She died because of her work," James said quietly. The sergeant's head snapped up. "Excuse me?" James didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. "You're saying someone killed her?" the younger officer asked. James rose to his feet with effort, joints stiff with age. "I'm saying she was threatened, harassed, followed. Files went missing, evidence destroyed." The sergeant's face darkened.
That's a serious accusation. So is what you accused me of, James replied evenly. The words landed, heavy and deserved. The younger officer opened his mouth, then closed it again. She collapsed in her office. Official cause was a heart aneurysm, stress-related. He looked down at the stone. Funny thing is, she never had heart problems. The sergeant scribbled notes. Was there an investigation? James nodded. Brief, quiet, forgotten. By who? The younger officer pressed. James looked directly at him. By people who were relieved she was gone. Silence. A woman's voice broke it. James? They turned. An elderly black woman stood at the edge of the path, leaning on a cane. Her back was bent, but her eyes were sharp as broken glass. Miss Eleanor, James said, warmth breaking through his voice. She approached slowly, stopping short when she noticed the uniforms. What's this? You finally arresting the dead now? The younger officer stiffened. The sergeant cleared his throat. Ma'am, we're just asking a few questions. Eleanor snorted. About what? Flowers? She turned to James. You all right? James nodded. I am now. She looked at the officers again. Margaret saved my grandson, she said bluntly. He was 15, wrong place, wrong time. They wanted to bury him. The sergeant's pen paused. She didn't just save him, she taught him he mattered. The younger officer swallowed. You boys should be ashamed, harassing this man at his wife's grave. We didn't know, the younger officer started. Eleanor raised a hand. That's the problem. You never do. She turned back to James, softening. You tell him about the letters? James hesitated. The hate mail? He asked quietly. Yes, the threats. The sergeant looked up sharply. What letters? James exhaled. She got them weekly. Slurs, warnings, promises. He reached into his coat again, slower this time. From an inner pocket he pulled out a folded envelope, yellowed with age. I keep one, to remember what she stood against. He handed it to the sergeant. The paper shook slightly as the man opened it. Inside were words scrawled in thick black ink. You don't belong here. Keep pushing and you'll end up where you belong. We know where you live. The sergeant's jaw tightened. The younger officer's face went pale. You showed this to the police? The sergeant asked. James nodded, several times. And? They told her to be careful, then they told her to stop provoking people. Eleanor laughed bitterly. Provoking, that's what they call truth. The wind picked up, fluttering the paper in the sergeant's hands. He folded it carefully and handed it back. I'm sorry, he said, quiet enough that it was almost lost. James accepted it without comment. A police radio crackled from the car. The sergeant answered, listened, then stiffened. Yes, we're still here. He hung up and turned to James. There's something else, he said. Records we pulled, about your wife's last case. James's eyes sharpened. Which one? The sergeant hesitated. A wrongful death suit, against the department. The younger officer's head snapped up. Against us? Against officers, the sergeant corrected, before our time. James nodded slowly. She was close to winning. Eleanor spat on the grass. That's when it got real ugly. The younger officer rubbed his neck. Why is all this coming up now? James looked around the cemetery. The stones, the silence, the weight of years. Because patterns don't disappear. They wait. A group of visitors nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. Whispers spread. Phones came out. The sergeant noticed and stiffened. We should move this conversation. James shook his head. No. Both officers looked at him. This is where it belongs, James said. She spent her life standing in public so others didn't have to suffer in silence. The sergeant studied him, really studied him now. You're not afraid. James smiled sadly. I buried my fear with her. Another radio crackle. Sergeant, a voice said, we've got media on the way. Someone tipped them. The younger officer cursed under his breath. Eleanor smiled. About time. James closed his eyes for a moment, hand resting on Margaret's stone. I told you. Patterns. When he opened them again, the cemetery no longer felt quiet. It felt awake, and for the first time in decades, James sensed that Margaret's work and her fight were not over. They were just being remembered.
The first news van rolled up to the cemetery gates just after noon. Its white paint gleamed under the sun like a warning flare. James watched it arrive without surprise. He had seen this moment in his mind more times than he could count. Not the cameras, not the microphones, but the reckoning. The part where silence finally lost its grip. The younger officer swore softly. "This is turning into a circus." "No," Eleanor said sharply, planting her cane into the grass. "This is turning into accountability." The sergeant straightened his uniform, jaw tight. "Sir, I need to ask you again. Are you willing to make a statement?" James looked down at Margaret's headstone. He thought of her standing in crowded courtrooms, voice steady while others tried to drown her out. He thought of the nights she came home shaking, not from fear, but from rage she refused to let rot inside her. "Yes," he said, "but not here." The sergeant nodded. "We'll escort you." "Not like that," James added, glancing at the patrol car. "I walk." The sergeant hesitated, then stepped aside. James walked past the officers, past the cameras now setting up beyond the gates, past strangers who suddenly looked at him not with suspicion, but curiosity. Eleanor walked beside him. "You ready?" she asked quietly. James smiled faintly. "I've been ready for 30 years. They stopped under a large oak tree near the entrance, a natural gathering place, shaded, visible, impossible to ignore. By the time James turned around, 3 cameras were pointed at him. A reporter stepped forward. "Sir, we're hearing that police questioned you for visiting this grave weekly. Is that true?" James looked directly into the lens. "Yes." "Why?" "Because my wife is buried here," he said evenly, "and because some people still don't like being reminded of what she stood for." Murmurs rippled through the small crowd. Another reporter cut in. "Were you harassed?" James paused. He chose his words carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for the truth. "I was treated like a problem," he said, "not a person." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably behind him. A third reporter spoke. "Your wife was a civil rights attorney. Are you suggesting her death was connected to her work?" The air tightened. James inhaled deeply. "I'm saying she was threatened," he said, "ignored when she asked for protection, and forgotten when she died." The sergeant stepped forward. "We are reviewing those claims." Eleanor scoffed loudly. "Reviewing? 30 years late?" The sergeant met her gaze. "Better late than never." She raised an eyebrow. "We'll see." James lifted a hand slightly, a quiet request for calm. "There's something else," he said. The crowd leaned in. "My wife kept records," James continued. "Letters, case notes, names." The reporter's eyes widened. "And where are those records now?" one asked. James tapped his chest lightly. "Safe." The younger officer stiffened. "Sir," James turned to him, "you stopped me because you thought I didn't belong here. That's the same mistake people made with her." The officer flushed. The sergeant cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, if what you're saying is accurate, we'll need those documents." James nodded. "You'll have them." "When?" a reporter demanded. "When I know they won't disappear," James replied calmly. The tension crackled. A woman near the back of the crowd raised her phone higher. "My mother knew Margaret Carter. She said your wife saved her job." Another voice followed. "She helped my uncle fight a false charge." Then another, and another. Stories poured out like water breaking through a dam. James felt his chest tighten, not with grief, but with something dangerously close to hope. The sergeant's radio crackled again. "Sergeant," the officer said urgently, "Internal Affairs wants to speak with you, now." The sergeant exhaled slowly. "Understood." He turned to James. "This is bigger than I thought." James met his eyes. "It always was."
The younger officer swallowed. "Sir, I owe you an apology." James studied him, not with anger, but with clarity. "Learn from it," he said. "That's enough." The officer nodded, shame clear on his face. By the time James left the cemetery, the story was already spreading. By the time he reached home, his phone wouldn't stop ringing. Former colleagues of Margaret's, old clients, journalists, activists, and then a knock at the door. James opened it to find a woman in her 40s, sharp-eyed, professional. "Mr. Carter?" she said. "My name is Angela Brooks. I'm with the state attorney's office." James raised an eyebrow. "That was fast." She smiled thinly. "Your wife had a way of accelerating things." Inside, she sat at the small dining table Margaret had once cluttered with legal briefs. "We found her last open case," Angela said, sliding a folder across the table. "It was never officially closed." James's fingers brushed the paper. "Against 3 officers," Angela continued, "one of whom retired with full benefits." James closed his eyes briefly. "And now?" he asked. Angela leaned forward. "Now we're reopening it." James laughed softly, not from humor, but from disbelief. "Do you know how long I waited to hear that?" Angela nodded. "Longer than you should have." She hesitated. "But there's resistance." "Of course there is," James said. Angela met his gaze. "That's why we want you involved, publicly." James looked at Margaret's photo on the wall, her smile frozen mid-laugh. "She hated the spotlight," he murmured. Angela followed his gaze, but she never ran from it. James stood. "Give me 1 day, then I'll give you everything." Angela nodded. "That's all we ask." After she left, James sat alone in the quiet house. The weight of memory pressed in, heavy, but no longer suffocating. For the first time since Margaret's death, the silence didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like anticipation. Outside, across the street, a police cruiser idled. James noticed it through the window. He smiled faintly. "Still watching. That's fine." He reached for the old filing cabinet in the corner, untouched for years. As he slid open the drawer, the past stared back at him. And this time, it wasn't asking to be forgotten. It was demanding to be heard.
By nightfall, James Carter's name was everywhere. It scrolled across news tickers beneath flashing headlines. It echoed through radio talk shows and late-night news panels. It trended online, paired with grainy photos of a quiet black man standing alone at a grave. Police question man for visiting wife's grave weekly. Civil rights attorney's death re-examined after husband speaks out. What was buried with Margaret Carter? James didn't watch any of it. He sat at his dining table under the yellow glow of a single lamp, folders spread out like a map of the past. The air smelled faintly of old paper and lemon cleaner, Margaret's scent. She used to clean when she was anxious, said it helped her think. He opened the first folder. Letters. Threats, mostly. Anonymous, typed, some handwritten in angry scrawl. "Drop the case. You're making enemies. Think about your husband." James's jaw tightened. He remembered the night Margaret had shown him the first one. She'd laughed then, not because it was funny, but because fear refused to live in her. "They're scared," she'd said. "That means we're close." He moved to the next folder. Court filings, depositions, names highlighted in red ink. One name appeared again and again. Officer Daniel Hargreave. James leaned back slowly. Hargreave had testified in 3 separate cases Margaret worked on, always against her clients, always with contradictions, always protected. Hargreave had also been one of the first officers at the scene when Margaret collapsed outside the courthouse 31 years ago. Heart failure, they'd said. Stress, they'd said. Tragic, but natural. James had known better. The phone rang. James didn't jump. He answered calmly. "Yes." "Mr. Carter," Angela Brooks said, "I wanted you to hear this from me first." James closed the folder. Go on. Internal Affairs has opened a formal investigation into Officer Hargreave and 2 others, she said. They're pulling old files, evidence logs, testimony transcripts. James closed his eyes. And? He asked. And things aren't lining up at all, Angela said. James exhaled slowly. Good. They never did. Outside, the police cruiser across the street remained parked. James noticed a second one pull up behind it. Watching. Not protecting. Watching. He hung up the phone and stood, walking to the window. He didn't hide. He didn't turn off the light. He wanted them to see him. Across town, in a conference room filled with polished wood and stale coffee, men in suits argued in low, urgent voices. This is getting out of control, one said. We're reopening things that should have stayed buried. A gray-haired man slammed his palm on the table. They were buried for a reason. And now they're clawing their way back up, another replied. Someone pulled up a photo on a tablet. Margaret Carter at a podium, mid-speech. She was a problem, the man muttered, and now her husband is turning her into a martyr. The gray-haired man leaned back. Then we discredit him. How? Same way we always do, he said. Question motives, dig into his past, make him look unstable. Back in his living room, James poured himself a glass of water and sat in his old armchair. He felt calm, too calm, the kind of calm that comes right before a storm. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. Unknown number. You should stop while you can. James stared at the screen. Then he typed back. James, you had 30 years. I'm not stopping now. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. No reply. At dawn, James returned to the cemetery. The gates were already open. A few reporters lingered at a distance, but no officers approached him this time. They watched. He knelt beside Margaret's grave and placed fresh lilies at the base of the stone. They're scared, he whispered, just like you said. The wind rustled the trees. For the first time in decades, James didn't feel alone there. As he stood to leave, a woman approached him hesitantly. She was elderly, white-haired, clutching a folded newspaper. Mr. Carter? She asked softly. Yes. She swallowed. Your wife helped my son. He was arrested in '89, falsely. James nodded. She told me about him. The woman's eyes filled. She saved his life, and when she died, no one ever asked questions. James placed a hand over hers. They are now. More people began to approach. Stories spilled out. Margaret defending workers fired unfairly. Margaret exposing falsified police reports. Margaret refusing settlements when justice was worth more. By noon, the cemetery felt less like a burial ground and more like a gathering place. Across the city, a former officer sat alone in his kitchen, watching the news. Officer Daniel Hargreaves' hands shook as he muted the TV. This isn't happening, he muttered. His phone rang. He didn't answer. It rang again, and again. Finally, he picked up. Yes. We need to talk. Now, a voice said coldly. By evening, the state attorney's office released a statement. New evidence has emerged calling into question the circumstances surrounding the death of civil rights attorney Margaret Carter. A full review is underway. The city reacted like a nerve had been struck. Some applauded, some protested, some panicked. James sat at home as Angela arrived with 2 investigators. He handed over the folders without ceremony. This is everything. Nothing altered, nothing missing. Angela nodded. You kept them safe. For her, James replied. As they prepared to leave, one investigator paused. Mr. Carter, he said quietly, you know this won't be easy. James smiled faintly. It never was. That night, as James lay in bed, sleep finally came.
Not heavy, but honest. And miles away, in an office filled with locked cabinets and secrets, someone shredded documents, far too late. The silence had broken, and it was only getting louder.
By the next morning, the tone had changed. Not softened, sharpened. What began as curiosity had turned into scrutiny, and scrutiny, James knew, was dangerous, especially when it threatened people who had survived decades by never being questioned. Outside his modest brick house, the police cruisers were gone. In their place sat something worse: news vans. Satellite dishes rose like steel flowers, cables snaking across sidewalks. Reporters murmured into microphones, rehearsing lines that framed James Carter as either a grieving widower or a calculated agitator. James watched them from behind his curtains, coffee cooling, untouched in his hand. Margaret would have hated this part. Not the attention, she could handle that, but the distortion, the way truth got bent into spectacle. A knock came at the door. Firm. Official. James opened it to find two men in suits, neither smiling. "Mr. Carter," the taller one said, "we're with the city attorney's office." James stepped aside without a word. They didn't sit. "We want to clarify something," the shorter man said, glancing around the living room, eyes lingering on framed photos of James and Margaret laughing on a beach long ago. "You've suggested publicly that your wife's death was mishandled. I didn't suggest it, I documented it." The taller man's jaw tightened. "You understand that reopening this case could destabilize public trust." James met his gaze. "Public trust isn't fragile because of truth, it's fragile because of lies." Silence. The shorter man cleared his throat. "We're advising caution." James smiled faintly. "You're advising silence." They exchanged a look. "We're advising what's best for everyone," the taller man said. "For everyone," James repeated, "or for the people who signed her death certificate without an autopsy." The men left shortly after. Outside, a reporter caught sight of them and shouted questions. The men didn't answer, but the cameras caught everything. Across the city, talk radio crackled with debate. Some callers praised James as brave, others called him obsessed. One host asked aloud whether grief could warp perception. James heard about that one later. He didn't respond. Instead, he went back to the cemetery. This time, he wasn't alone. A small crowd had gathered. Retirees, former clients of Margaret's, a few young activists holding handmade signs that read, "Truth still matters," and "Justice has no expiration date." James stood beside the headstone, hands folded behind his back. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The stone spoke for him. A man in his 60s approached hesitantly. "She helped my sister, back when no one would." A woman nodded. "She got my husband his job back after they framed him." Story after story layered themselves over the grass like leaves. Margaret wasn't just remembered, she was recognized. And that terrified the wrong people. That afternoon, Internal Affairs subpoenaed records from 3 precincts. By evening, a retired medical examiner appeared on television, voice shaking as he admitted procedures hadn't been followed in Margaret Carter's case. By nightfall, Officer Daniel Hargreaves' name surfaced again, this time tied to missing evidence logs. The backlash came swiftly. James' mailbox filled with letters, some kind, some vile. One read simply, "You don't know who you're messing with." James burned that one in the sink. He slept lightly, dreamt of Margaret standing in a hallway filled with locked doors, calmly unlocking them one by one. The next morning, Angela Brooks arrived with news. "They're pushing back, hard," she said. James nodded. "They always do."
Someone leaked that you declined a settlement years ago, Angela continued. They're framing it as proof you're driven by money. James laughed quietly. Margaret hated settlements. I know, Angela said, but narratives don't care about facts. They sat in silence. Then Angela leaned forward. There's something else. James looked up. One of the officers involved back then, not Hargreave, contacted us anonymously last night. James' pulse quickened. Why? He says he wants to talk, off record. He's scared. James closed his eyes briefly. Fear had finally changed sides. That afternoon, James was summoned to City Hall. Not invited, summoned. The hearing room buzzed with tension. Council members whispered, lawyers shuffled papers. James took his seat alone at the witness table. Across from him sat men who hadn't aged well with power. Mr. Carter, the chairwoman began, you've accused this city of negligence bordering on corruption. James leaned toward the microphone. No, I accused individuals. The city is simply where they hid. A murmur rippled through the room. You're aware that your claims could incite unrest. James looked at the gallery, at faces old and young, black and white, familiar and unfamiliar. Unrest, he said calmly, is what happens when truth is delayed too long. One councilman scoffed. You expect us to believe your wife was murdered? James reached into his briefcase. He placed a single document on the table, an evidence transfer slip, with a date that didn't match the official record, a signature that shouldn't exist. The room went silent. You expect me, James said, to finally ask why her heart stopped the same week she subpoenaed internal police emails. No one spoke. Outside City Hall, the crowd grew. Chants echoed, not angry, demanding. By evening, the governor's office announced an independent task force. James heard the news while standing at Margaret's grave again, the sky bruised purple overhead. They're running, James whispered, just like you said they would. The wind stirred the grass. Somewhere, a phone rang unanswered, and in the shadows of a city built on forgotten truths, the pressure mounted, not on the man who visited a grave every week, but on those who had hoped the grave would keep its secrets forever.
The call came just after midnight. James was awake already. He sat at the kitchen table, hands folded around a mug he hadn't touched, the house quiet except for the old clock ticking on the wall. He'd lived with silence long enough to recognize when it changed texture, when it stopped being empty and started being expectant. The phone rang once, then again. James answered without hesitation. Yes? This is Lieutenant Harris, a voice said, low and strained. Internal Affairs. James straightened slightly. I was wondering when you'd call. There was a pause on the other end, as if the man hadn't expected that. We have someone who wants to talk, Harris said. Off the record. Former officer. He was present the day your wife collapsed. James closed his eyes. 31 years collapsed into a single breath. When? He asked. Now, Harris replied, before he changes his mind. They met in a nondescript building on the edge of downtown. Beige walls, buzzing fluorescent lights, the kind of place designed to leave no memory behind. The man waiting inside looked older than his years. His shoulders sagged like he'd been carrying something heavy for decades. His name was Paul Keegan. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't look James in the eye. I didn't kill her, he said immediately. I need you to know that. James nodded once. I didn't come here to accuse you. Keegan swallowed hard. I stood there, he said. That's what I did. I stood there and watched. His hands shook. She collapsed on the courthouse steps. People think it was sudden, but it wasn't. She'd been sick for weeks. Not the kind you feel in your body, the kind you feel when you know someone's closing in. James listened without interrupting. She told us, Keegan continued, that morning, said if anything happened to her, we should check the files logged under H7. James's heart thudded. H7, he repeated. That file category was decommissioned in the 90s. Keegan nodded. Because it held internal complaints, officers testifying falsely, evidence tampering. Who shut it down? James asked. Keegan hesitated, then said the name. Daniel Hargreave. The room felt colder. She was going to expose him, Keegan said, and others. She had copies, hard copies. She told me she trusted her husband with the rest. James's jaw tightened. You could have spoken up, James said quietly. Keegan laughed bitterly. I tried, once. I was told I'd lose my badge, my pension, my family. So you stayed silent. Yes, Keegan whispered, and I've hated myself every day since. When James left the building, dawn was breaking. The city looked the same, but it wasn't. By noon, Angela Brooks stood beside James at a press conference held on the courthouse steps, the same ones where Margaret had collapsed. Cameras flashed, microphones clustered. James felt the weight of the moment settle into his bones. Angela spoke first. Last night, a former officer came forward with sworn testimony confirming that Margaret Carter's investigation into police misconduct was actively obstructed. A murmur rippled through the crowd. James stepped forward. My wife believed that truth didn't belong to institutions. It belonged to people, and people deserve it, no matter how uncomfortable it becomes. A reporter shouted, Mr. Carter, are you saying your wife was murdered? James paused. I'm saying, he replied, that she was silenced. The words landed like a bell struck hard. Within hours, sealed files surfaced. H7 wasn't gone. It had been moved, hidden inside a storage facility leased under a shell company tied back to the police union. The revelation detonated. By evening, Officer Daniel Hargreave was placed on administrative leave. By midnight, his house was surrounded by reporters. Inside, Hargreave sat alone, staring at a photograph of himself in uniform, younger, confident, untouchable. His phone buzzed endlessly. He didn't answer. James returned to the cemetery that night. No cameras this time, no crowd, just him and Margaret. They're running out of places to hide, he said softly. The wind lifted fallen leaves, scattering them across the grass. James smiled faintly. The next day, subpoenas flew like sparks. Bank records, phone logs, email archives. A second officer resigned. A third requested immunity. The story shifted. It was no longer about a man questioned at a grave. It was about a system that had buried truth alongside the dead. But not everyone wanted it unearthed. James received another message, this one handwritten, slipped through his mail slot. Stop now, or the next grave won't be symbolic. James read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it in his briefcase. He brought it straight to Angela. She's scared, she said. That's when they're most dangerous. James nodded. Margaret always said fear makes people sloppy. That afternoon, a judge ordered the release of all evidence tied to H7. Boxes were rolled into courtrooms, names spilled out, patterns emerged, and a familiar truth surfaced again and again. Margaret Carter was right about all of it. At the cemetery that weekend, something changed. The police no longer watched James. They stood at a distance, not guarding him, but guarding the truth he represented. A young officer approached him hesitantly. My mother knew your wife. She said she was brave. James smiled gently. She was honest. That's harder. As James turned to leave, he noticed fresh flowers at Margaret's grave. White lilies. No note, just acknowledgement. The city hadn't healed yet, but it had stopped pretending nothing was wrong. And somewhere deep beneath stone and soil, the truth, long buried, was breathing again, waiting, one final time.
The trial began on a Monday. Rain fell in slow, deliberate sheets,
as if the sky itself understood the weight of what was about to unfold. James Carter stood on the courthouse steps, hands clasped behind his back, watching people file inside. Reporters, activists, former officers who avoided eye contact, families who had driven hours because Margaret Carter's name meant something to them, because her work had once saved their sons, their daughters, their dignity. Inside, the courtroom felt too small for the history it was about to hold. Daniel Hargreaves sat at the defense table, his face pale, jaw clenched. Gone was the confident officer who once barked orders in cemeteries and parking lots. This man looked cornered, not by evidence alone, but by time. James took his seat in the front row. He carried nothing with him. He didn't need to. The first witness was Paul Keegan. His voice shook at first, then steadied. I was ordered to delay evidence, to misfile complaints, to ignore sworn statements. And who gave those orders? The prosecutor asked. Keegan swallowed. Captain Daniel Hargreave. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Hargreave stared straight ahead. The next witness was a forensic analyst who confirmed what had long been denied. Margaret Carter's medical records had been altered, symptoms removed, timeline shifted. Not enough to scream murder, just enough to bury truth under bureaucracy. James closed his eyes. He remembered that night, Margaret on the couch, rubbing her temples, saying softly, "If anything happens to me, promise you won't stop." At the time, he thought she was being dramatic. He'd learned since then how often truth sounds like exaggeration until it's too late. Day after day, witnesses spoke. Files once hidden were projected on screens. Emails, memos, payment trails. The courtroom stopped feeling like a place of law. It became a confession chamber. On the fourth day, Hargreave took the stand. His lawyer advised against it. He insisted. "I didn't kill anyone," Hargreave said. "I did my job." The prosecutor leaned forward. "Your job involved silencing a whistleblower." "No," Hargreave snapped. "It involved protecting the department." "And from what?" the prosecutor asked calmly. Hargreave hesitated. "From truth." Everyone felt it. The question lingered in the air like smoke. When Hargreave finally looked toward James, something broke in his eyes. "She was going to ruin lives," he said hoarsely. James stood. The judge allowed it. "She was trying to save them," James replied. Silence followed. Absolute. 2 weeks later, the verdict came. Guilty. Not of murder, but of conspiracy, obstruction, abuse of power. Enough. Enough to end careers. Enough to expose systems. Enough to vindicate a woman who could no longer speak for herself. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as Hargreave was led away. James didn't watch. He went somewhere else. The cemetery. The grass had been freshly cut. The air smelled clean. Margaret's headstone stood just as it always had. Simple, dignified. But something was different. Beneath her name, beneath the dates, a new line had been carved. She told the truth. James ran his fingers over the letters. This time he didn't cry. He sat on the bench beside her grave, watching people pass. Some stopped. Some read. Some bowed their heads. One elderly woman approached slowly, leaning on a cane. "I didn't know her," the woman said, "but I read about her. I was afraid to speak up once. Seeing this, it helps." James nodded. She would have liked that. That evening, the city council announced sweeping reforms: independent oversight, public access to complaint records, mandatory transparency. Words that once sounded impossible now rolled easily off tongues. But James knew better.
Change didn't come from policies, it came from people refusing to be quiet. Weeks later, the officer who first questioned James at the grave resigned. No press conference, no statement, just a quiet exit. James never heard from him again. Life didn't magically become easier. Grief didn't evaporate, but it softened. It became something James could carry without bending. On the anniversary of Margaret's death, the cemetery filled. Former colleagues, students she'd mentored, strangers who'd been helped by her work without ever knowing her name. James stood before them. My wife believed graves shouldn't be the end of stories. They should be reminders. He gestured to the headstone. They questioned me because I came here every week. They thought it was suspicious. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't waiting for the past. He smiled softly. I was standing guard over the truth. As the crowd dispersed, James remained, alone again, but not isolated. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows. James stood, straightened his coat, and placed one final flower at Margaret's grave. See you next week. And for the first time in a long time, the silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was peaceful. Because the real story, the one written not in police reports, but in stone, had finally been read, and it would never be buried again.